Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webcast brought to you by Compliance Week. I'm Matt Kelly, editor of Compliance Week, and I'll be your host this afternoon. Today we're going to be talking about data archiving and best practices therein. Before we hear from our guests, let me quickly go over the agenda for this afternoon. First, we are scheduled to go for 1 hour. I'm going to give a very brief introduction here, and then we will jump right into the presentation that is sponsored by Iron Mountain. That presentation will then be followed by a question and answer session. Your questions will be kept confidential and anonymous, so please don't be shy. You can ask your questions at any time using the Ask a Question function on the left-hand side of your screen, and I'll pose them to our guests at the end of their presentation. So after the Q&A, I will wrap up the webcast. I should also say that this webcast will offer CPE credit for all attendees. Please disable your pop-up blockers in your web browser in order to access the exam. And to obtain your CPE credit, wait until the webcast is completely over and I sign off. At that point, the final exam will present itself automatically on your computer screen in a separate window. And again, be sure that your pop-up blockers are disabled. If you have any trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving the CPE certificate, please send an email to info@complianceweek.com to request a copy, and we can get one out. If you missed any of these instructions, don't worry. I will repeat them all at the end of the webcast as well. A few other administrative details. At any time during the presentation, listeners can download the slides from a drop-down menu on the left-hand side of your screen. You can also hit the View Slide Full Screen button along the bottom of your computer if you wish to increase the slide size. And lastly, a Help button is located on the upper right-hand corner of your screen for assistance. Today's webcast is part of a series that Compliance Week launched a few years ago. We hold these webcasts just about every week, usually on Thursdays, and our guests have been chief compliance and governance officers at leading public companies and experts on various compliance, regulatory, and governance and risk topics. I will not read the upcoming schedule since that is on your screen, but if you would like to register for any of our webcasts, you can always visit www.complianceweek.com for details, and they are all generally free to all registrants who come. I should add one other point. If you do find these webcasts useful and enjoyable, you should consider attending our Compliance Week 2015 conference. That happens this May in Washington, D.C., where on our agenda we cover most of these same topics in person that we are discussing here from week to week. The conference is May 18 to 20 at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, and it will usually have around 500 to 550 compliance and audit professionals. We would love to have you attend as well, so if you are interested, please visit our conference website. That is conference.complianceweek.com. You can see the agenda there. You can get registered, and I should add the early bird rate for our conference registrations expires at the end of this week, so please act quickly. Those are all of the administrative details. We can now get on with our program. We have two guests today to talk about data archiving. The first is Jason Buffington from ESG. That is a research firm that studies data management, and Jason himself has been following the data management market for more than 20 years. Joining him is John Sharp from Iron Mountain, which I said is a sponsor of our webcast. John is the Director of Data Management Business at Iron Mountain, and the two of them have an interesting presentation coming up. We are certainly glad to have you guys here. Jason, I think you are going to get us started.
I am. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where this is coming from. My name is Jason Buffington, and as mentioned, I'm a senior analyst with the Enterprise Strategy Group. I've been in data protection for 25 years, and that includes the gamut of not only traditional backup and snapshots and replication, but certainly archiving and data management aspects as well as availability. And then later I'll be handing it over to my colleague, John Sharp. So let's talk about the premise of this first conversation is everyone should archive, period. Everyone should archive. And if I were to offer even beyond the data management, data preservation, compliance aspects, the bottom line is for most organizations of almost any size, you truly cannot afford to keep doing storage the way that you used to. Case in point, so ESG does some annual research every year on data growth rates. And in my 2014 data, I'll tell you that production storage is growing around 42% year over year. Similarly, secondary and tertiary storage, what many of us might call protection or preservation storage, is growing at almost the same rate, 38% year over year. And yet budgets are growing about 7% year over year. And there was a slide that popped up that I wasn't expecting, but the bottom line is you can't keep doing what you're supposed to be doing, because in general we're seeing budgets increase between 6 and 9%. If your storage is growing between 38 and 42, you can't keep doing it the way that you have been. And in fact, when we look at what those budgetary expenses are, we see that in 2014 our numbers were about 38% of new IT budgets were spent on new technology products or purchases. The other 62%. So what is that? Roughly 5 out of 8. 5/8 of your overall IT budget is just spent on maintaining what you've got. Well, at the rate that you're growing, you just can't keep affording to do that. By the way, what's interesting from a compliance angle on that is that that number is even worse for organizations that are older. So for those organizations that actually have a longer depth of tenure and therefore more data to manage or to retain, those numbers go down even further. So only 34% of their IT budget in 2014 was actually committed to new technologies. The other 66% was actually spent on maintenance.
So Jason, this is John here. So from my view, IT is supposed to be innovative, but it's pretty tough to innovate when such a large chunk of your time, effort and money is spent on legacy systems. Most of the IT folks I speak with are looking for real ways to shift this balance, and in some cases, IT is even being looked at as a way to drive actual revenue, which is extremely hard to do when the budget focuses more on today than the future. Is that what you're seeing as well?
Oh, absolutely. The whole idea is IT is supposed to be enabling this growing ecosystem that the business is actually demanding. But in this case, they're barely they're treading water. And at this rate, storage alone will exceed what they're already able to do, and those numbers could actually get smaller unless people do storage smarter. There's certainly some other areas of the IT infrastructure, whether it's virtualization, whether it's cloud adoption, et cetera, that actually warrant those new technology purchases and projects. But frankly, a majority of what people are buying in new storage in this case is really often spent in simply adding capacity for the new data while still paying for expensive production storage on the old data, which is arguably stagnant. So we've got to do something smarter. And so what most people...
When we look at your demographics here, when I see N equals 562, can you comment just for a minute on the demographic breakup and who we're talking to and what segments and industries? Do you have that information to share?
Yeah, sure. So most of this data is about a 60-40 mix of enterprise to mid-market organizations. ESG defines an enterprise as 1,000 seats and up. Mid-sized organizations, we have between 100 and 999. So it's about a 60-40 mix, enterprise to mid-market, and it's about an 80-20 mix of North America to Western European. So it's a pretty nice gamut of folks as far as, and in fact, in this particular data, when we looked at it last year, it was actually statistically indefinable between mid-sized organizations and enterprises. The numbers were nearly identical in most of the spending categories. So let's talk about an answer to the problem. When we talk about how do we do storage better, one of the first things that often comes to mind is the idea of, well, I need to start doing archiving, or I need to archive more, or archive better. Before we go there, and I do think that we do need to go there, that's the topic of the webinar today, I would offer first that arguably IT today is in what I think of as the third phase of understanding what an archive is or should be. It wasn't that many years ago that folks, and in fact, if you've been dealing with compliance for more than 5 years or so, you'll hopefully appreciate this. Phase one, everyone used to talk about archiving and backup being arguably the same thing. It's like, oh, well, maybe backups are to disk and archives are to tape or some messy variants like that, but they treated them basically as the same kind of behavior. And then a couple years later went on and they realized, oh, wait, actually that's not the same thing. In fact, they're completely separate. And so we should have separate processes with separate administrators, using separate storage silos with separate technologies, using separate strategies and separate policies to retain that data. The problem is that while that is a meritorious approach, no one can afford to do that. If you had to do everything in complete isolation and parallel, then no one does it. In fact, what people find is more and more often we see that folks are saying, well, maybe backups are what I have to do and archives are what I should do, and I won't get around to doing both because of my budget, because what we just saw on the last slide, so that goes to the wayside. Now, fast forward a few more years.
So Jason, at Iron Mountain, just real quick, we still see a lot of organizations who are living in phase one because they're a little bit paralyzed. They don't know how to move and make the right decision going forward. So they use their backup tapes as a de facto archive, which I'm sure we'll get into this, going forward here, but causes a lot of problems with getting your data back down the line. So we definitely feel the pain across phases 1 and 2. They're definitely not past.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Thankfully, we're at least in the third phase where this is where we know that we're going to be going to. What I would offer to the folks at home is that while they are not interchangeable, they are complementary. And so let me kind of break that down a little bit for you. When we did phase 1, by calling them the same thing, that confuses everyone. And to your point, John, people that are still doing that today are going to find challenges because since they're not really the same thing, you're going to have challenges with restoration. The folks that are in phase 2 that said everything should be completely separate, I think that pendulum has swung too far. It doesn't really help people to try to do everything in complete isolation and parallelism because the reality is that you're not going to be able to achieve both in the economics that most of us have to deal with. And that kind of leads us to what that third phase is. So if it's not doing number 1, we're not doing number 2, we're really going to embrace that idea of complementary. But even when we say that they're complementary, there's arguably 3 definitions of how folks are treating I'm going to archive as a verb. And so just in shortness, and then we're going to talk about more of the technologies that go behind that, there are some folks who just say, I got to archive that off, and what they really actually mean is they're going to delete it. There's actually very few organizations that can just say, I choose to delete data. I choose to no longer have this at my disposal. And whether it's from a regulatory compliance perspective or just from an operational best practice of we should keep the old stuff in case we need it again. There's very few organizations that actually can warrant we're just going to choose to delete. So most of the time when we're really talking about archives and backups, we really want to kind of focus on is either the idea of archiving as a grooming behavior, meaning we're going to get that data off of production storage, off of that primary disk, onto less expensive storage while still maintaining the business requirements of retaining it for a long purpose. Typically that's an operational request. Versus preservation, which is where we're actually going to retain that data for long periods, not because we think we might need it again, but more often because regulatory speaking, someone has already told us you have to keep it for one reason or another. Now, when we asked folks, what do you mean when you mean a long-term storage process for information, it was interesting. We actually found about 63%, the larger blue wedge, actually said that their definition of we're going to archive is we're going to move data off. It was an operational benefit, not necessarily just a regulatory compliance benefit, which is what you see when they say in the yellow wedge on the left-hand side, we're going to make a copy of that data to retain for long purposes. So let's get in a little bit more into, why is it 63% or over half of folks that are thinking about long-term storage, why is it that they are moving data? And the interesting part is it's all around operational ROI. Moving from 12 o'clock and kind of moving around this wedge for a second, we can see 26%, so basically 1 out of 4 folks, are doing it to improve the performance of their primary storage systems. And in fact, I would offer to you that that if you look at the blue wedge up at the upper right and then the green wedge down the lower left, effectively that's over 50% because the blue wedge is I want to improve the performance of those primary systems. The 23% in the green wedge say we're going to reduce consumption of static or non-active data. That's half of the folks who are saying we just want to get things better there. And then we see in the yellow wedges and orange wedges at 4 o'clock and 9 o'clock respectively, I want to improve my backup because obviously if it's no longer living on primary storage, that's stuff that doesn't have to go to the backup solution as well. That's going to reduce your backup window. That's going to reduce the CapEx and the storage footprint of your secondary storage as well. That's going to improve the performance of my backup solution on the orange wedge because I'm not having to even catalog that stuff because that's part of a secondary process outside of my backup window. There's all kinds of reasons why grooming becomes an operational benefit that a lot of folks need to really kind of embrace. Let me take you through the quick math. So let's assume for a second, and your mileage will vary, but in a traditional data protection environment, one can typically presume that the footprint for secondary or protection storage is usually between 4x and 6x. Your deduplication rates will vary. of what your primary storage footprint is. So if you have a terabyte of production data, it's not uncommon to see upwards of 4, 6, or more terabytes of secondary data retaining previous full copies as well as previous partial copies, incrementals, differentials, have another copy offsite for regulatory BCDR preparedness. There's all kinds of reasons why. But the bottom line is, rough numbers, and this is generous, 1 terabyte of production and a 4x ratio means 4x of secondary storage somewhere throughout my footprint. Now in year 1 plus 4 equals 5. But let's go ahead and assume that using the numbers we had at the beginning of our webcast, an average of around 40% year-over-year storage growth-ish. All right, so in year 1, I've got 5 terabytes of data. In year 2, and I've got a little bit of a blinky going on. Here we go. Year 2, I've got 1 terabyte goes to 1.4. The 4 terabytes goes to 5.6. In year 3, now we're up to 2 terabytes of production storage. It's actually like 198-ish. And then in secondary storage, I'm up to 7.8. Total 9.8. So in 2 years, I've now gone up to nearly double my storage footprint because of 2 things. 1, secondary compared to primary, and then 2, a 40% year-over-year storage growth rate. All right. Simple math. Yours will vary, but I would challenge you to do this math yourself. Now here's the fun part. Let's assume, and this is an ultra-conservative number, let's assume that only 30% of your data is stagnant. There's a lot of environments out there that 50, 60, 70% of your data might be stagnant. But in this case, just to make sure everyone believes me, let's just assume 30% of my data is stagnant. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that 30%, that 300 gigs, right off of my production active storage volumes, hold that into an archive secondary storage container. And in this case, LTO, LTFS type tapes actually is a nice touch for this. But however you're going to store that data, we're going to take it out of production. And when we do, remember, 4x, primary to secondary, so now I'm only at 2.8 terabytes. If I combine those together right away, remember my initial footprint was 5 terabytes, now I'm down to 3.8 terabytes just because I said, okay, I'm going to take off the stuff that's stagnant. And remember, that was an ultra-conservative stagnant percentage. If I take that to year 2, primary storage grows by 40%. We know about that. 30% again is stagnant, so that's going to roll off of the back. And 4x the primary goes in the secondary. Do that again. And now by year 3, doing the same progressive math, we see that by the end of year 3, I'm only at 6.5 terabytes of secondary storage, or excuse me, of total storage, compared with I started my solution, remember, at 5 terabytes. So the point is that by getting rid of the stagnant data, in fact, you may find that if your stagnant data rate is higher than your year-over-year growth rate in overall storage, you literally could have a declining storage footprint. Try that in 9 out of 10 IT environments, and they won't believe you, but it's true because of the amount of stagnant data is there. So the math really, really makes sense. Now, John mentioned earlier that one of the things that Iron Mountain is seeing is that some folks are using backups and archives interchangeably. And while I made a point earlier to talk about the fact they are complementary processes and that they're not the same thing, one of the more interesting things that we have been seeing more in market lately is the idea of folks using the same tool set to derive both their backups for restoration as well as their archives for retention. And that, I think, is really interesting. In fact, when we asked folks last year, how are you actually achieving your archive capabilities within your business, it was interesting to see about 83% are using the archive features within their backup product as part of, if not their only archiving solution. 35%, that blue wedge on the right, are using their archiving features as their only archiving product. Another 48%, nearly half, of folks said they're using the archival features within their primary backup software as part of their archival strategy. And I think what's different here, and love to hear John's feedback on this as well, what's different here is that in times past, when people were treating backups and archives interchangeably, it was really because the backup software guys were in marketing were trying to have a new word to talk about something in a more interesting way, or they were trying to differentiate from disk and tape. But today, we're actually seeing legitimate things like extended hold. We're seeing things like policy-based management that actually is aware of whether it's PII or social security numbers or other data elements that are in the backup store, and actually enhanced search, mobile search. There's a lot of capabilities that are now being added to backup software as well as to protection storage like deduplication arrays. to allow for a legitimate archival solution without necessarily investing in an autonomous, isolated archival product. And that's an interesting angle, because then what we'll see is actually we should see more people embracing archiving as a behavior, because they're using the same pane of glass they're using for data protection today.
Yeah, so Jason, this is John. These are truly great innovations in archiving and backup software. Unfortunately, even as you noted, not everyone's actually using them yet. So even for those who are, the developments are fairly recent. If you look back 2 or 3 years in most organizations, you really won't have access to those features, which means that there's probably still a lot of backup media out there, probably millions of tapes that are still serving as a de facto archive, right, in phase 1, with really no great features built in to get that data. So if you're an organization that's keeping data for 7 to 10 years, most of your backup media probably falls into the suboptimal category. So we're at a little bit of a time lag here with the innovation.
Absolutely. Let's talk about that for a second. So the features that are in the software, and John's right, in most of the backup software that is actually offering legitimate archival type scenarios today, those features are 2 to 3 years old. The challenge that most people have, as John mentioned, is that in most cases, what people have been erroneously calling an archive or a long-term data set is really just an old backup tape that hasn't been recycled yet. And I would offer to you that if that's the case, you don't have an archive. What you have are a whole bunch of blank tapes that you have no idea what's really on them, because arguably the software that you were using 3, 4, 5, 7, 10 years ago is not the software you're using today, which means you have no way of figuring out what's on those tapes. And I know John's going to talk about that a little bit later in the discussion. But my point here is that for the software solutions that you have today, there is the possibility. In fact, in some cases, it's checkbox. There's one backup software product I'm familiar with that they've been in backup for 20-some-odd years. They've added these archival features, and literally within the UI of the backup management console, it's checkbox. Would you like to groom the data while you're here? It's not an exact quote, but you get the idea. And if you check the box, it's a single one pass across the production data set, and as the data is verified to be backed up, it says, okay, now I'm going to go ahead and stub it out, and I'm going to move that data off. It's a move, not a copy for those purposes. But anyone who's just using those old tapes, they don't have a backup or an archive because, frankly, they don't have the platform to get the data back if they needed it. But we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we go along the way. So the interesting thing is that at least today, if you realize that what you really need is to manage your storage better, there's a high likelihood that if you're using a contemporary data protection solution, some level of grooming is almost assuredly built in. In addition, from a compliance perspective, many of the ones, especially the larger folks that also ship not only a backup product line item, but also an archival solution as well, are starting to integrate rudimentary archival functionality into their backup software. And so moving forward, you've got new options ahead of you that should be fairly easy to turn on because the backup solution is already pervasive across your infrastructure. How you get your old data back into a recoverable, restorable state, that is a different business challenge, and I know John's going to talk about that. But before we do, remember, this is just how are you going to get the data there. And for most folks, even just being able to go to the backup team and say, hey, I just needed you to turn on that archiving feature, it's going to be a challenge because you have to justify from the business what are you going to do to change your processes for that. And so let me kind of talk through that for a second. There we go. Oh, sorry. You know, when we asked folks, why do you do backups? When you ask folks why do you do backups, it's always the same thing. Well, I got to get my data back. I have to have previous versions in case something goes wrong. What's interesting is that when you ask folks why do you retain data for long periods of time, it's a much wider variety of answers. Certainly, and as appropriate to this audience, compliance with regulatory retention regulations tops the list, both in all factors driving as well as the primary factor driving. But also look at these others. Improving end-user access to the data. This comes back to the point that if you can't find it, arguably it doesn't exist, or at least isn't available to you anymore. There are certainly litigation support requirements. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes as well. Reducing the time and cost associated with restoring data in the event of a disaster or outage. here's the point here, and this kind of goes back to not only are you improving production storage when you talk about data archiving, you're also improving secondary storage as well, because if it's not on primary when something goes bad, you won't have to eat time or effort to restore it when you're trying to do a recovery exercise. So it improves your secondary performances as well. And then, of course, adherence to internal records management policies. So there's a wider variety of business value that comes from retaining data for long periods of time. And what I typically tell the backup guys is, if I'm talking to a backup audience, I'll say, look, you and I both know that the way that you cost justify data protection is you go straight to the server team or the workload team and say, if you need to get a previous version back, I'm your only solution. What I would tell the IT manager that works who's deciding whether or not to archive more or archive better is look at all the different business value. Go 10 cup to all of these departments because you really need to be doing archiving more than you think, and all of these have a collective ROI that's arguably even better than the ROI that comes from a responsible backup solution. All right. So those are the factors that are driving a long-term retention. Let me just kind of walk you through a few more points, and then I want to turn it over to John for a few minutes. Certainly one of the interesting things we asked about was, why do you retain data was the first one. This one is, how do you decide what data to retain? And what I think is interesting about this particular data point is certainly regulatory compliance comes on top of the list. I mean, somebody else told them what to retain. But all the rest of these is interesting enough. So frequency of access, what the data creation was, what the thresholds of capacity were, file size. It's a long list, and that's actually my point. The business should decide what data should be kept in for how long. And what you'll see here, and by the way, with an N of 223 on this survey, the response range of, say, 40 to 47% is statistically nearly flat. The point is there's several different ways that people are deciding what data to be held. And in all cases, it really should be a business-driven conversation based on the context of the data, not an IT decision based on whether we think it's too hard, too complex, or non-cost justifiable. We also did ask, and this is actually a similar result, so what are the metrics of building the case to demonstrate that long-term storage of data value? Certainly we saw things such as reduction of primary storage costs and fewer staff around the general administration. Again, you're managing less, which allows you to focus those IT on the new and enabling parts of IT initiatives and not the maintenance tasks. It goes right back to what John and I were talking about from a treading water perspective from before. And this last one, just as a last data point that I thought was interesting from a how do you decide what to do for long-term storage. I always think it's interesting when folks look at tape versus disk, and Iron Mountain, I hope you'll let me kind of soapbox for just a second on this. It really bugs me when people talk about what tape is compared to disk in a data management, data protection world. There are folks out there that talk about tape is slow, tape is not durable, tape doesn't have limited capacity, longevity path. It seems like the only thing it has going for it is shelf life. And most of those complaints are 20 years old. Most of those complaints have been around since people were first trying to help customers understand why should you back up to disk instead of to tape. And so it started out legitimately. But over the last several years, it's really turned into FUD. Bottom line today, a single tape cartridge actually has the same durability or higher MTBF than a single spindle in a disk drive. The capacities have grown inordinately. We see new access methods like LTFS, which makes a tape look like a disk from a mountable file system perspective, much like 10 years ago people were trying to make disk look like tape in VTL virtual tape libraries. So it's interesting to me when people complain about tape as it looked 20 years ago, because the bottom line is there's no other part of IT that looks like it did 20 years ago. Why would you think that tape has stagnated? And in fact, when we asked folks what were your challenges in storing data for a long period of time, I thought it was really appropriate to find out that, primary concern was data growth, right? And that makes sense. As data grows, I'm going to have to store more of it. Okay, I got to figure out how to do that. Certainly the management of that is important. Also the operating costs of that. Both of those, by the way, are best managed when the tapes are under management. And I know John's going to talk about that in just a few minutes. But what I thought was interesting was the data longevity of tape and the data longevity of hard drives actually scored statistically as the same concern level of challenges expressed, because people are understanding that, this is not your daddy's tape or your granddaddy's tape for that matter, that modern tape is very much a viable solution for long-term storage today. And in fact, in many cases, it has not only CapEx benefits, but OpEx benefits as well. So that's the challenges. Let's look at the benefits. So the benefits of this, certainly we saw when you're storing data for long periods of time, as you might imagine on this audience, improved compliance with regulatory attention, improved storage management, and then all the other things we talked about so far, improved performance of primary systems, improved end-user access to the data because they can actually find it, because an archive always comes with a catalog and index, and then kind of goes down through the line. So there's lots of reasons why folks should be doing that. But the one that always seems to loom, the one that probably folks in a compliance conversation really want to talk about is e-discovery. So when we ask IT managers, has your organization been involved in a regulatory inquiry or legal proceeding, so e-discovery type effort, and oh, by the way, were you personally, as the IT manager, involved in that? Here's what they came back with. 63%, 5 out of 8. Said, yes, I have personally been involved in that solution. So not only was the organization involved, but the IT manager himself was part of that discovery exercise. Another 15% said the organization was, in yellow, but that particular IT person had not yet. And what I think is interesting, though, is the green wedge. Only 20%. So 1 out of 5 folks said, I was not personally, and neither was my organization. The other 4 out of 5 folks have been part of an e-discovery exercise so far. John, I'd love to hear, what are you seeing around this? You've got to be seeing this all day long.
Yeah, so some of our customers tell us that these are the most painful IT experiences possible. Having to locate data for litigation can feel like really looking for a needle in a haystack. And even once you find the needle, or in this case the tape, you still have to figure out how to crack it and make the data useful, make the tape useful. Right? It's a very, very hard problem. It's very hard to crack old tapes without the hardware and software that was present back in the day they were written. So huge IT pain point that we hear about all the time at Iron Mountain.
Absolutely. All right. So that's the frequency. Now, the other thing is that some folks will say, like, well, I dodged a bullet. I didn't have to do that this year or this week or this month. And here's what I want to tell you. These are going to continue to be pervasive across the way. So when we asked folks in 2013, so this survey research was done in the spring of 2014, so looking back a year, we asked folks, how many of those kinds of activities have you been involved with? And as you can see here, this is not just a once in a while kind of thing. I mean, this for most organizations is a persistent request or requirement. We asked folks, okay, so during those discoveries, what kind of data would you expect? And typically when people think about e-discovery, they think email, right? And certainly that's up there, right? 56% of e-discoveries requested email, a little over half. But database records, financial statements, invoices, general office productivity, that's Word docs, Excel, et cetera. There's a wide variety of what folks are looking for. And so if the only thing, and here's one of the punchlines, if you're taking notes, please write this down. If the only thing you are archiving is email, then everything else on this list you are out of compliance for. Most of the time what you're looking for is content of data, not a particular data type. So be thinking about that as you think about, okay, so this will happen to you. It's going to happen more than you think. The kinds of data that you're going to be requested to come back with is varied. And here's the ugly one. When we ask those same IT folks, what is your confidence level? This is a subjective number, right? What is your confidence level that you'll be able to produce the electronic evidence upon request as part of that legal proceeding or regulatory inquiry? 48% said very confident. Okay. Any other answer other than very confident is wrong. Confident, semi-confident, pick your favorite other words that are on there. But the bottom line is if you are not very confident, if you don't have anything better than a shadow of a doubt that you actually can get that data back, then you are in jeopardy. And by you, I mean you, not just the organization. But at that point, your disaster recovery strategy, to take a little pun on this, is an updated resume. So really big risk there. So let me finish off with 3 things I think folks really ought to internalize as part of their 2015 data management perspective. And screenshot this if you want it. Ping me on Twitter as jbuff if you like. But here are my 3 realities for data management in 2015. Number 1, your storage requirements will continue to outgrow your IT budget. So you have to figure out how you can do something different with colder data. The reality is you cannot keep doing what you have been doing, much less do anything better. Number two, when you need to retrieve your data, you will very likely not be using what you use to store it. When we asked folks how long have you had your primary production backup server, half of all respondents said they'd had their backup solution, regardless of version, for less than 3 years. And I think what is really interesting is because most people, when they buy data protection, data management, or any other infrastructure service, they tend to buy it on a 3-year lifespan. They buy it based on the anticipated useful range of the hardware plus 1 or 2 years of software maintenance. So when half of the respondents have said they've had their primary data protection solution for 3 years or less, that means you don't have that legacy access to that old data. And so in a few minutes, when John talks about what are you going to do with those tapes that are 7 or 10 years old, who, by the way, were written by a product that you no longer own or no longer can maintain, that's a big challenge. So my point to you is when you need to retrieve that data, you will very likely not be using what you actually used when you originally stored it. And then third, I hope this gets folks' attention, and there's a little tongue-in-cheek in this, but not much. If you can't find it, I would argue it doesn't exist. Now, technically, yeah, it's probably still on one of those tapes. But the bottom line is the catalog matters. The index matters. If you can't find it upon request, whether that request comes from a helpless user or whether it comes from a very powerful lawyer, if you can't find it, you can't give it. They don't have it, and you're going to pay for it. So, short version, if you can't find or retrieve your data, from my perspective, it doesn't exist, good, bad, or otherwise, and the consequences that come along with that. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to John. John?
Thank you very much, Jason. So this has been a great discussion with some really insightful analysis and great data points from Jason and ESG. Archiving and long-term retention are clearly challenges that almost all IT organizations have to reckon with. And at Iron Mountain, we recognize this, and we've developed some services targeted specifically at helping organizations overcome these challenges. So today, I'll briefly describe a new offering we have called the Restoration Assurance Program, which can help customers and organizations who are still using old backup tapes, 7, 10-year-old backup tapes, as their de facto archive, which obviously, as Jason has pointed out, is not really a sustainable way of going forward, but it is the reality, unfortunately, causes a lot of problems. So this program has many goals. As Iron Mountain, we'd like to help organizations store media with the utmost security and chain of custody, exacting the environmental standards. We want to help organizations understand what's on their tapes. We want to give organizations confidence, as Jason noted that this is sorely lacking, that they can reliably restore their data when they need it. And in the process, we want to be able to save organizations money and allow them to focus on strategic IT and not firefights. It was discussed earlier that many companies still use their backup tapes as a de facto archive, and this is tough to keep track of, and cracking old tapes really is not an easy process in most cases. So let's dive into some of the common challenges with this approach. First, let's start with tracking information on archival tapes. If you're storing thousands of backup tapes over several years, do you know what's on each tape? If you had to search for a specific user or a specific email or a specific file in those tapes, would you even know where to start? Many IT departments simply wouldn't. Maintaining backup systems. Do you have systems up and running that can read a 7-year-old tape? If so, what's it costing against your budget to maintain those systems? If not, how are you doing any restores if you don't have the systems? How are you getting into those tapes when the general counsel calls? Big challenge. Managing silos of information and systems. As companies get larger and larger, systems proliferate. Many of our customers are challenged knowing what data is where, especially as time passes. Managing incompatible backup systems. It's not uncommon to have multiple backup systems across an organization, but it makes restoration exponentially harder to manage for the IT department. And finally, managing and maintaining access to information. If your organization is continuing to keep legacy systems up and running solely to respond to future data requests, you're probably spending money that could be better spent elsewhere. Worse, what happens when your old stack is no longer supported by the manufacturer? What happens if it fails right before a big litigation data request? It sounds like a big penalty could be on the way. These aren't the only challenges when it comes to data restoration, but these are what we most commonly see at Iron Mountain. So let me tell you about our restoration program briefly here, which can really help organizations be successful in the face of these challenges. We've created a service that consists really of two parts: managed restoration service and offsite tape vaulting. The concept is really simple. We'll store an organization's media in our secure vaults, and we'll ingest their backup catalogs into a specially designed system. We can then use the catalog metadata to understand the type of data on each tape, when the tape was generated, which servers are on which tape, etc. When the customer requires a restore, for example, a litigation event occurs, all they have to do is call Iron Mountain and request the data back for a certain user or a certain set of files or any other information held on the tapes. We already have at Iron Mountain all the tapes in custody. We have access to the catalog information to know what's where. We have the skills to crack the tapes. The data is just a call away for the customer. This is a secure, reliable solution that removes the firefight and provides confidence in restoration that's sorely lacking today. And you can retire all those old systems and save the licensing and maintenance costs. If this sounds interesting, we'd certainly love to discuss it further with you. And with that, I'll leave it on this slide and hand back to Matt.
Thank you very much, John. And we are talking with Jason Buffington from ESG and John Sharp of Iron Mountain. We're going to move on to the Q&A portion of our webcast now. One quick note here. If you do want to see a copy of the slides that they have been presenting, just use the download, you can download it from the drop-down menu on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. So guys, we do have a few questions here. I'm going to throw them out in no particular order. First one coming in was whether or not you recommend any dedicated hardware for archiving. Jason, I think that's probably more up your alley. What could you say to start there?
Repeat that question. A little bit of an IP challenge.
Sure. Do you recommend any dedicated hardware for archiving?
I don't hardware per se. We recommend that you need to be thinking that actually is designed for long-term data retention. And so there's you can get certainly folks out there protections that their backups type of rate. If they do that, those solutions have some level of attribute, so the data selectively open. We don't want backup storage dedicated volume are optimized for data retention. More often than not, I still as much as any, just because as I said before, the before does now, and dollars, the shelf life and the OpEx and CapEx, it's hard to beat that for true long-term data retention.
Okay. Somebody else asking, how often do you recommend grooming the database?
Ooh, that's a good one. So two things. One, you're going to have some folks, some kind of data that's going to be externally regulated, and so they're going to tell you how often to do it. If you're just talking about grooming data, if you're just talking about purging it off for preservation purposes, there's a lot of great technologies that will actually do that as part of the data protection behavior. And so in those cases, having those kind of solutions where as part of the backup the archive also happens is interesting.
Could you guys maybe talk a little more about the importance of data classification and data formats to make sure that data storage works over the long term? And I guess in particular, I'm not so much interested in best practices as much maybe as like what are some of the worst practices that you have seen companies do that are common mistakes you would recommend they avoid?
John may have one on this as well, but I would say the single biggest complaint or biggest mistake is treating a backup pool as an archive. I mean, I cannot emphasize enough how flawed that logic is. If you only have to hold your data for 2 years, maybe you can get away with that. But once you're past that 5-year mark, the idea of how am I going to get data from an old backup pool back when I need it in a timely manner, it just drops off tremendously. So I mean that's the biggest single problem. The other classic mistake that I see a lot of folks make is just to assume that archiving is not viable before they've actually done even a little bit of diligence to understand the business impact of doing nothing, and then comparing that with the economical and easy-to-use solutions that are available in the market today.
Sure. And
so I would agree with Jason, especially on the first point. I mean, backup formats are not intended to be archival formats, right? Mm-hmm. They're proprietary. They're not open. Over time, they become very difficult to go back and crack open if you're not using the exact same environment that was used to create them, right? So
sure.
As time passes, you just dig yourself a bigger, deeper hole. It becomes more and more tough. And usually these are firefights. Usually this is the legal department calling IT and saying, hey, we have a big lawsuit or we have a big litigation event that could cause us a real problem. We need these emails between these two users, from 5 years ago, and we need them ASAP, right? Mm-hmm. And that causes the IT department to drop what they're doing, pretty much go crazy trying to find that needle in the haystack. And as Jason noted, there's not a heck of a lot of confidence that they can actually do that in a predictable or reliable way, right? So this is a huge risk for the company, for legal, and for IT. Huge pain.
Yeah. But one thing, let me pile on one more thing though. Just
sure.
Remember this: when we're talking about archiving and data management, just remember that you're not that organizations of all sizes should not be thinking about archiving just as an e-discovery avoidance regulatory mandated scenario. There's a huge amount of business value that comes day in and day out, even if you never meet a lawyer in your whole IT career, mm-hmm. By doing better data management, by holding the subset of data that actually is relevant for long-term retention and letting the rest of it fold off the backup set. Arguably, you should, if you're archiving better, you should be backing up far less, because the stagnant data shouldn't continue to be part of the backup solution. You're going to get a lot of huge OpEx and CapEx day in, day out business value out of proper data management above and beyond ensuring you're prepared for the lawyer coming down the hall.
Well, that kind of leads into the two questions I had here that are somewhat interconnected. Maybe I'll put them to you both at the same time here. Like, number one, somebody was asking, how long do you recommend keeping an archive? Up to, like, forever, I suppose. But number two, I am just wondering how often companies might get into the trap of ignoring data destruction if archiving is something that you wind up doing well. I mean, there's a lot of data that people would say, you should get rid of it as soon as you legally are allowed to get rid of it and dump it. Sure. But I've seen many companies who get into this save everything mentality just because you can, which is not a good idea. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts along those lines about how long can you keep an archive, or could that sort of eclipse the good policy of destroying data that you should destroy as soon as you can?
So that's fair, and I think that since this is the last question, I'll let John have the final word on it. So mm-hmm. let me weigh in on this one before he does.
Sure.
This is the very classic and I'm sure underused IT response. It depends. It depends on the industry. Mm-hmm. It depends on the business value of the data. In fact, in the ESG research that most of these slides came from, we looked at different data types. How long do you keep email versus how long do you keep files versus how long do you keep database? So the kinds of data will have some impact on that. The industry that you're in, the regulations there will also have some impact on that. I absolutely agree that data destruction should be part of this as well. At some point, whether it's an old backup tape that could be recataloged and pulled back in if you wanted to, whether it's an archival store, or even whether it's just data that's living on primary storage, at some point there are several kinds of data that kind of like the leftover fish in your refrigerator need to be destroyed after a very fixed period of time. Because in the same argument that if you can't find it, it doesn't exist, one could equally say if the data is reconstitutable, it does, whether you or your lawyers want it to or not. Mm-hmm. And so data destruction should be part of the plan. What we've seen, though, is that for the last several years, we've really just been trying to help the industry overall understand, keep it longer than you think you do, but do it in a cost-effective way. Now, as that pendulum has continued to swing, what you're seeing is folks saying, okay, well, how long is too long? And so now we have to kind of bring that back to the middle a little bit and say, and yes, data deletion or data destruction should be part of that. By the way, turns out Iron Mountain knows how to break stuff as well as keep it. So with that, I'm going to give it back to John, and thanks to folks at home for their time today. John?
Sure. John?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Let me add a little bit of curveball and nuance to what Jason just said. I agree with all of it. We've talked about one use case of data that can, business data that can be subject to legal hold or litigation or compliance, but there's a whole other category of data that is future value generating assets. Think about movies, think about entertainment, think about seismology and oil and gas research. I mean, this is data that no one's going to come litigate you about. But if you're an organization, a movie studio, you want to keep those masters forever. Like, you never want to let those go away. You always want to have access to that data in case you want to monetize it going forward, right? So there are use cases for, keeping data for a long, long time. One company or one organization that we work with at Iron Mountain is called SciArc. And SciArc is a nonprofit that seeks to document World Heritage Sites and make sure that even if those heritage sites degrade or are destroyed over time, over 1,000 years, say, you can still get a 3D view of the sites just like you were there. Right? So we've been helping them to capture that data and store that data such that it lasts into perpetuity. So there are different use cases, and it all goes back to being able to get to the data when you need it, whether it has a certain lifespan to be compliant and not put yourself at risk, or whether it has no lifespan other than forever. Being able to keep it for the right amount of time and get to it is absolutely critical from our view.
All right. Well, gentlemen, we are approaching the end of the hour here, so I think we will have to wrap up. But this has been a very informative discussion, so thank you very much. We really appreciate your time. And again, everybody, that was John Sharp, Director of Product Management at Iron Mountain for the data management line of its business, and Jason Buffington, who is a Senior Analyst at ESG, talking with us about data management. We'd like to thank them for their comments, and of course, thank you to Iron Mountain for making this webcast possible. This webcast has been recorded, and it will be available online within the next hour or so. CPE credit is also available to subscribers to Compliance Week subscribers for our archived webcasts. Please check out our on-demand CPE library under the webcast tab at www.complianceweek.com. Now, for this webcast and the CE credit for what you've just heard, once again, to obtain that CPE credit, wait until I finish this wrap-up momentarily, and I will say farewell, and please disable the pop-up blockers on your web browser to access the exam. This webcast will close itself automatically, and the final exam will then present itself in a new window on your computer where you can take the test. If you have any trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving the CPE certificate, you can please send an email to info@complianceweek.com to request a copy, and we will get that out to you as soon as we can. So that concludes this webcast today. I'm Matt Kelly, editor of Compliance Week. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good day, and goodbye.